survive almost anything if you just figure out how to become invisible.
Another entry revealed. The Fictional Diaries of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Kitchen of Tensions, Bath, Ohio, family home, 1967, winter, 1974. Chapter 1, The Recording Device. Some rooms are like tape recorders that never get turned off. They soak up sounds and hold on to them forever, storing every word and silence in their walls like invisible archives. In our house on West Bath Road, that room was the kitchen. It wasn't the biggest room or the fanciest, just a narrow galley with yellow linoleum floors and cabinets painted the color of avocado ice cream. But somehow it became the gravitational center of our family's slow-motion collapse. The wallpaper had this cheerful pattern of little teacups and saucers, all lined up in neat rows like they were waiting for a tea party that would never come. But I think the plaster underneath was absorbing everything else. Every word with a razor edge, every coffee cup slammed down too hard, every silence that stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. The Kenmore refrigerator hummed constantly from its spot by the back door, a steady electrical drone that became the baseline sound of my childhood. That was the musical note that everything else got built on top of. Sometimes the harmony was Mom, humming along to the Lawrence Welk show while she peeled potatoes at the sink. Sometimes it was Dad's wingtip shoes, clicking across the yellow linoleum when he got home from his shift at PPG Industries. But most of the time it was voices, climbing higher and higher like a thermometer in July heat. I spent thousands of hours sitting at that kitchen table, doing homework, eating meals, and watching my parents perform their daily ritual of tearing each other apart with words. The table was yellow formica, with thin metal strips around the edges that were always coming loose, making little sounds when you bumped against them. Before that, we'd had a real wood table that Grandpa Dahmer had made with his own hands. I used to stare at the grain patterns in that wood while spelling lists and multiplication tables swam around in front of my eyes. There were lines in the wood that crossed over each other like tiny highways, and knots that looked like whirlpools frozen in amber. If I focused on them hard enough, the sounds in the room would start to fade out, like someone was slowly turning down the volume knob on our old Zenith radio. I learned early that a kitchen isn't just for eating. It's for fighting, too. It's where you go to get the things you need to survive. Sometimes that's a peanut butter sandwich. Sometimes it's having the last word in an argument that's been simmering for years like soup on a back burner. The kitchen taught me that geography matters. Every family fight has its own territorial logic. The sink was Mom's territory. She'd stand there washing the same plate over and over when she was angry, her hands moving in violent circles while her mouth stayed shut. The stove belonged to both of them, a neutral zone where they'd bump into each other reaching for coffee or salt, their bodies careful not to touch, even accidentally. Dad claimed the space by the phone, where he'd lean against the wall making important calls to his supervisor or his brother in Milwaukee, his voice loud enough to make sure Mom heard every word about overtime pay and weekend shifts. The table was supposed to be neutral ground, but it became a battlefield more often than not, with me caught in the crossfire like a small country between two warring nations.
Oh, where are my manners? My name is Grimwick. And that was just one page of tonight's diary.
Chapter 2. Mom's medicine cabinet and Dad's chemistry set. Mom kept her medicine bottles lined up on the formica counter by the sink, like little brown soldiers standing at attention. Valium, Darvon, something called Milltown that came in white tablets the size of baby aspirin. She had a whole system for them. Morning pills, afternoon pills, bedtime pills. Different colored capsules for different kinds of problems that I wasn't old enough to understand, but old enough to recognize. She'd stand at that counter every morning around 10 o'clock, after Dad had left for work and I'd gone to school, organizing her pharmaceutical arsenal with the precision of a pharmacist. I know this because I started coming home for lunch in 3rd grade, claiming I forgot my lunch money when really I wanted to observe her daily ritual. The bottles had labels with her name typed on little white stickers. Joyce A. Dahmer. Take as needed for anxiety. Joyce A. Dahmer. Take 1 tablet every 4 hours for pain. The pharmacy was Rexall Drug on Market Street, and Mr. Peterson, who ran it, always smiled too wide when he saw our family coming, like we were his best customers. I'd watch her count out pills into her palm, calculating dosages with the same methodical approach Dad used for his chemistry experiments in the basement. 2 blue ones, 1 white one, sometimes a yellow capsule that she'd hold up to the kitchen light to examine before swallowing it with a glass of water, or sometimes coffee if she was in a hurry. Mom wasn't always there when she was standing right in front of you. Her hands would do what they were supposed to do, stirring Campbell's tomato soup, opening a can of Green Giant corn with the swing-away opener, folding towels from the laundry basket, but her eyes were looking at something nobody else could see, something floating in the air about 3 feet to the left of whatever she was actually doing. I'd watch the water for Prince spaghetti start to bubble up and spill over the edge of the pot, making that angry hiss on the red-hot electric burner. She wouldn't notice until the smell of burning aluminum started filling the room like a smoke signal. Then she'd jump like someone had grabbed her shoulder from behind and holler, "Oh, for crying out loud!" in this voice that sounded surprised by her own existence. Dad approached problems differently. He was a chemist through and through, trained to believe that every question had a logical answer if you just applied the right formula. He'd come home from PPG Industries at 5:47 every evening. I could set my watch by the sound of his Buick pulling into the driveway, carrying his black briefcase like it contained state secrets. He'd set that briefcase down by the phone with a little thump that announced his arrival to the whole house. Then he'd wash his hands at the kitchen sink with this special soap that was supposed to get rid of chemical residue, scrubbing between his fingers like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Everything Dad did was systematic. When he made coffee, he measured the grounds with a little metal scoop, counting out the exact number needed for a full pot. When he read the Akron Beacon Journal, he folded it into precise rectangles so he could read 1 column at a time without the pages flapping around. Even the way he arranged his dinner on his plate followed some internal blueprint. Meat on the left, vegetables on the right, potato in the middle. He tried to apply this same logical approach to family problems, explaining Mom's condition to me using chemistry metaphors about neurotransmitters and chemical imbalances that could be corrected with the right pharmaceutical intervention. "Your mother's brain chemistry is a little off balance," he'd say, drawing invisible molecular diagrams in the air with his finger. "The medicine helps restore equilibrium. But some problems can't be solved with formulas, and I think that frustrated him more than he ever admitted." Chapter 3. The Electric Field. When Dad's car pulled into the driveway each evening, the air pressure in the kitchen would change, like we were all trapped inside a barometer. I could feel it before I heard his key in the side door. That same electric tension you get right before a summer thunderstorm hits, when the hair on your arms tries to stand up and all the birds stop singing at once. He'd walk through that door, carrying the smell of industrial chemicals and machine oil, his work shirt stained with things I couldn't identify. Mom would be at the stove, stirring something, or standing at the counter chopping vegetables. And this invisible force field would snap on between them like someone had thrown a switch. They didn't even have to look at each other. The quiet itself would get loud, if that makes any sense. It was the kind of silence that has teeth, that bites at the edges of normal conversation until everything sounds forced and artificial. "How was your day?" Mom would ask without turning around from whatever she was cooking. "Fine," Dad would answer. already reaching for the evening paper. Busy. The Henderson boy came by selling magazine subscriptions. I told him we weren't interested. Good. Mrs. Patterson called about the church social on Saturday. These weren't really conversations. They were more like diplomatic exchanges between two countries that had signed a ceasefire but hadn't actually ended the war. Every word was carefully chosen, every pause measured. They were both testing the electrical current between them, seeing how much voltage they could handle before something sparked and caught fire. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my homework spread out in front of me, worksheets about long division or the state capitals. But I wasn't really doing math or memorizing geography. I was studying a much more complex subject, the physics of human relationships when they start breaking down. I learned that arguments don't just start. They build up over time like pressure in a steam engine. All the little irritations and disappointments accumulating until the system can't contain them anymore. Dad's late nights at work, Mom's mysterious headaches that kept her in bed for days, bills piling up on the kitchen counter, David crying in his crib upstairs, the car making that grinding noise when you turned left. 100 small frustrations looking for an excuse to explode. The explosion, when it came, always seemed to be about something tiny and ridiculous. Dad leaving his coffee cup on the counter instead of putting it in the dishwasher. Mom buying the wrong brand of laundry detergent. Who forgot to take out the garbage or pick up milk at the store. But it was never really about coffee cups or laundry detergent. It was about two people who had somehow become strangers, sharing the same kitchen, the same house, the same last name, but not the same life anymore. Chapter 4. Building Escape Routes. The kitchen taught me that getting too close to people was dangerous, like sticking your finger in a light socket. You could be sitting there minding your own business, working on a book report about Charlotte's Web, or practicing cursive letters, and a stray word from one of their fights would ricochet off the refrigerator and smack you right in the face. One wrong look, one innocent question about what we were having for dinner, and suddenly you were part of the battle, whether you wanted to be or not. So I learned not to look at them directly during the danger hours, that stretch between Dad getting home from work and all of us going to bed, when the electrical field was strongest. I got very good at looking at things instead of people. The way steam curled up from Dad's coffee cup in the morning, making little question marks in the air before disappearing. The hairline crack that ran across the corner ceiling tile above the sink, growing a little longer each month, like a slow-motion earthquake. The bubbles that rose through a glass of carnation instant milk, each one carrying a tiny piece of light to the surface. Things were safe. Things were predictable. They didn't suddenly explode in your face for reasons you couldn't understand or control. That's when I perfected the skill I'd first discovered in the hospital. The ability to be there and not there at the same time. I could sit in my chair at the kitchen table, fork in hand, moving lima beans around my plate in careful geometric patterns, and my eyes would be looking down at my food, while my mind slipped away down that long hallway inside my head. The farther I walked down that internal corridor, the more the kitchen sounds faded out. Mom's voice getting thinner and more distant. Dad's footsteps becoming softer and softer, until even the refrigerator's hum disappeared completely into white noise. Some people have a clinical name for this: dissociation. I learned later from a school counselor who was trying to figure out why I seemed so detached during parent conferences. To me, it was just a survival skill you learned when you had to, like swimming or riding a bike. When the world got too loud or too bright or too dangerous, you just stepped sideways out of it for a while. The beautiful thing about this escape route was that it was completely invisible. My body stayed right there in the kitchen, chewing food and occasionally nodding when someone asked me a direct question. But the essential part of me, whatever it was that made me, me, was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere safe and gray and quiet, where angry words couldn't reach. They never noticed when I disappeared like that. How could they? They were too busy launching verbal missiles at each other to pay attention to one quiet kid who'd learned not to make any noise that might draw fire in his direction. Sometimes I'd walk so far down my internal hallway that I'd forget where I was for a minute. I'd look up from my plate and not recognize the kitchen, like I was seeing it for the first time. The yellow walls, the teacup wallpaper, my parents sitting across from each other at the same table where we ate every meal. It would all look like a photograph from someone else's family album. Chapter 5. Theater for an Audience. When company came over, the Kowalskis from next door, her Uncle Bob and Aunt Ruth driving down from Youngstown for Sunday dinner, the kitchen would transform into a completely different room, like someone had waved a magic wand and replaced our broken family with professional actors. Dad would open the side door for our guests, and that invisible electrical fence between him and Mom would just vanish into thin air. The voices that had been sharp as broken glass 5 minutes earlier were suddenly smooth as honey. Mom would glide around the kitchen like she was floating on air, her hands steady and sure as she offered people coffee and her famous chocolate chip cookies that she only made when we had an audience. She wouldn't burn anything or forget about pots boiling over. The medicine bottles would disappear from the counter, hidden away in the cabinet above the stove, where visitors couldn't see them. Her smile would be bright and genuine, her laugh musical and warm. She'd ask about other people's children, remember birthdays and anniversaries, offer second helpings with the grace of a professional hostess. Dad would become charming and articulate, explaining his work at the chemical plant in terms that made it sound important and interesting, instead of just a job that kept him away from home 14 hours a day. He'd tell funny stories about his co-workers, ask intelligent questions about Uncle Bob's insurance business, compliment Aunt Ruth on her new permanent wave. They would stand close enough to touch, occasionally brushing hands when they both reached for the sugar bowl or the cream pitcher. They'd finish each other's sentences, share private jokes, present a united front of marital happiness that was so convincing I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined all those fights. I watched this transformation happen dozens of times, and I filed away every detail like a detective gathering evidence. It was the most important lesson of my childhood. What seemed real and solid could be bent and reshaped in the blink of an eye. You could take a room that was a war zone and turn it into a Leave It to Beaver episode just by having the right audience walk through the door. The truth didn't matter as much as the performance. What mattered was what people could see, what they believed they were looking at. Everything else was just backstage drama that the audience didn't need to know about. I learned that every family was really two families, the private one that existed behind closed doors, and the public one that performed for neighbors and relatives and anyone else who might be watching. The trick was keeping the two versions separate, making sure the audience never accidentally wandered backstage during a performance. This was valuable information, revolutionary information. It meant that reality was negotiable, that you could control other people's perceptions by carefully managing what they were allowed to see. If you were good enough at building convincing scenery, you could make people believe almost anything. Later on, my whole life would become a kind of theater production. I'd get very, very good at constructing elaborate sets and costumes, at writing scripts that made audiences see exactly what I wanted them to see, and nothing more. But I learned the basic principles right there in that kitchen, watching Mom and Dad perform their marriage for company while I sat in the corner taking notes. Chapter 6. The Laboratory Years. By the time I was in junior high, I'd stopped trying to be part of whatever was happening in the kitchen and started treating it like a laboratory where I could study human behavior under controlled conditions. I wasn't the son anymore. I was the researcher, observing two fascinating specimens as they went through their daily routines of mutual destruction. Their fighting had evolved into something more sophisticated by then. Less shouting, more strategic silence. Dad would come home and go straight to his chair in the living room with the newspaper, not even bothering to stop in the kitchen for his usual coffee. Mom would bang pots and pans around with unnecessary force, sending signals through the house like a telegraph operator tapping out messages in domestic Morse code. When they did speak to each other, their conversations were masterpieces of passive aggression. "I suppose you'll be working late again tomorrow," Mom would say while scrubbing a skillet that was already clean. Not a question, not exactly an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered with surgical precision. "If you want to keep living in this house, someone has to pay the mortgage," Dad would reply without looking up from his paper. Also not quite an insult, just another fact presented for consideration. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my algebra homework spread out in front of me, pretending to solve for x, while actually solving for much more complex variables. What made people stay together when they clearly couldn't stand each other? How long could two people live in the same space while speaking different emotional languages? What was the breaking point where politeness finally collapsed into honest hatred? The kitchen had become my doctoral program in human psychology, and my parents were unwitting professors, teaching me everything I needed to know about the mechanics of relationships when they started breaking down. I learned that love wasn't the opposite of hate. Indifference was. I learned that silence could be more violent than screaming. I learned that people would endure incredible amounts of misery to avoid admitting they'd made a mistake. Most importantly, I learned that if you stayed quiet enough, if you made yourself small and unnoticeable enough, adults would forget you were there and reveal their true selves. They'd drop their masks and show you exactly who they really were, underneath all the pretense and social conditioning. The kitchen was where I first understood that most human behavior was performance, that people were constantly acting out roles they thought they were supposed to play. Parent, spouse, provider, caregiver. But underneath the costumes, they were just frightened animals trying to survive in a world that didn't make sense to them either. This knowledge was powerful and dangerous. It separated me from everyone else in a fundamental way. While other kids my age were still believing in the basic goodness of adults, I was learning that everyone was capable of cruelty if you pushed the right buttons. While they were trusting their parents to protect them from the world's dangers, I was discovering that the biggest dangers came from the people who were supposed to love you most. Chapter 7. The Scent of Ending. When I think about that kitchen now, and I try not to think about it too often because some memories are like picking at scabs, I don't smell the foods we ate there. I don't smell Mom's pot roast or the Folgers coffee brewing every morning, or the chocolate chip cookies she made for company. I smell something else entirely. The scent of a family slowly dissolving, like sugar stirred into water until it disappears completely. It's a smell with no name, sharp and metallic, like the air right before lightning strikes. It's the smell of electrical circuits overloading, of insulation burning away to expose dangerous live wires. That room was full of invisible fuses, and nobody knew which one was about to blow, or how much damage it would cause when it finally happened. The refrigerator kept humming through it all, that steady electrical drone that became the soundtrack to our disintegration. Even now, 20-some years later, I can close my eyes and hear that sound. Not just the motor running, but the vibration it sent through the floor and up through the legs of the kitchen table where I spent so many hours learning to be invisible. Some sounds stick with you forever, whether you want them to or not. They become part of your internal architecture, supporting beams in the structure of your memory. The refrigerator hum was the bass note that everything else in my childhood was composed around. Mom's pill bottles rattling, Dad's footsteps on linoleum, voices rising and falling like temperatures on a broken thermometer. I learned my most important survival skill in that kitchen: how to disappear while staying visible, how to be present but unavailable, how to watch everything without being seen watching. It was a talent that would serve me well in the years to come, though I didn't know that yet. I thought everyone learned to read people the way I was learning to read them, studying facial expressions like weather patterns, cataloging voice tones and body language, building detailed files in my head about what made each person tick. I thought everyone had escape routes built into their minds, internal hallways they could walk down when the world got too loud or too bright or too dangerous. I thought everyone understood that words were weapons and silence was armor, and that the space between people was a minefield you had to navigate very, very carefully. But most people, I would discover, lived their entire lives without building those kinds of defenses. They walked through the world with their emotional skin exposed, trusting that other people wouldn't hurt them for no reason. They believed in the possibility of honest communication, genuine intimacy, lasting connection. They had never sat in a kitchen that smelled like ending, watching two people who used to love each other tear themselves apart, one careful word at a time. They had never learned that love was just another kind of performance, that families were just groups of strangers who happened to share a last name and a mailing address. The kitchen taught me that getting too close to anyone was a mistake you could avoid if you were smart enough to learn from other people's failures. Distance was safety, observation was power, and silence, that beautiful, protective silence I'd discovered in the hospital, was the most reliable friend I'd ever have. I can still hear that refrigerator humming in my dreams sometimes, a sound that never changes, never stops, never gets tired of its own monotony. It's the sound of time passing, whether you're ready for it or not. The sound of everything slowly falling apart, despite everyone's best efforts to hold it together. It's the sound of my childhood, measured out in electrical cycles and recorded forever in the walls of a kitchen that probably still exists somewhere, still soaking up other families' secrets, still teaching new children how to become invisible when the people who are supposed to protect them start using words like weapons against each other. That kitchen was my first classroom, and I was an excellent student. I learned every lesson it had to teach, remembered every detail, filed everything away in that growing archive inside my head. I just didn't understand yet what I was being trained for, or how those lessons would be applied in the years to come. But the foundation was being poured, one argument at a time, one silence at a time, one careful observation at a time. The kitchen was building me into something specific, something that could survive in a world where love was temporary and pain was permanent. And the only person you could really trust was yourself. The refrigerator knew. It hummed its approval every day, keeping time like a metronome, marking the rhythm of my education in the fundamental unreliability of human connection. And I listened, and I learned, and I prepared myself for a life lived at a safe distance from everyone else, where observation was more valuable than participation, and where the most important skill was knowing how to disappear without actually leaving the room.
I trust you enjoyed this glimpse into a most curious diary. If so, leave behind a small token of your delight with a like, and do consider joining our circle by subscribing. And remember, ring the little bell, and you shall be the very first to know when another diary or a fresh entry emerges from the shadows. And if a whisper stirs in your mind, a thought, a riddle, perhaps a name of someone whose secrets you would dare to uncover, leave it from me below. I read them one by one. And who knows, your wish may guide my hand to the very next diary I choose from my collection.